Hello everybody, this is Mr. Lawback. In this video, I want to go over the very early state governments, which of course were formed out of the colonial governments. I would also like to talk about what some of the state governments had in common with each other, and the very early lead up to our first constitution, which was the Articles of Confederation. So while the Revolutionary War was being fought, leaders of the 13 colonies worked to change them into independent governed states, each with its own constitution or a written plan of government or a framework of government. At the same time, the Revolutionary Congress that originally met in Philadelphia tried to define the powers of a new central government for the nation that was coming into being. So these state governments we're talking about are not the Continental Congress. These are operating in each of the states, of course. By 1777, 10 of the former colonies had written new constitutions or state constitutions. Most of these documents were both written and adopted by the state's legislature or state lawmaking body. In a few of the states, like Maryland, Pennsylvania, and North Carolina, a proposed constitution was submitted to a vote of the people for ratification. Ratification meaning approval. So the actual voters of that state voted on whether or not to ratify the documents. Each state constitution was the subject of a heated debate between conservatives who stressed the need for law and order, and liberals who were more concerned about protecting individual rights and preventing future tyrannies. Although the various constitutions differed on specific points, they had the following features in common. A list of rights. Each state constitution began with a bill or declaration listing the basic rights and freedoms, such as jury trial and freedom of religion, that belonged to all citizens by right and that state officials could not infringe on or encroach on. So this, of course, was the early beginnings of the Bill of Rights. So most states had their own Bill of Rights at this point. Separation of power. With a few exceptions, the powers of the state government were given to three separate branches. Legislative powers to a two-house legislature, executive powers to an elected governor, and judicial powers to a system of courts. The principle of separation of powers was intended to safeguard against tyranny, especially against the tyranny of a too powerful executive or governor. Remember, the colonists did not like the idea of a too powerful executive. So voting. The right to vote was extended to all white males who owned some property. The property requirement, usually for a minimal amount of land or money, was based on the assumption that property owners had a larger stake in the government did the poor and property lists. So only stakeholders had a right to vote in the early states or colonial government. Office holding. Those seeking elected offices were usually held to a higher property qualification than the voters. So typically the office holders in the state or colonial level governments tended to be on the wealthier side. So the Articles of Confederation. At Philadelphia in 1776, as Jefferson was writing the Declaration of Independence, John Dickinson drafted the first constitution for the United States as a nation. Congress modified Dickinson's plan to protect the rights of the individual states. The Articles of Confederation, as the document was called, was adopted by Congress in 1777 and submitted to the states for ratification. So the Articles of Confederation had a very weak central government, and the states were basically able to operate like independent nations held loosely together. The Articles of Confederation was the Constitution that operated through the Revolutionary War and through the Treaty of Paris. Ratification of the Articles was delayed by a dispute over the vast Indian lands west of the Alleghenies. Seaboard states such as Rhode Island and Maryland insisted that these lands be under the jurisdiction of a new central government. When Virginia and New York finally agreed to cede their claims to Western lands, the Articles were ratified in 1781. So a couple of takeaways about early state and colonial governments. Many of these state governments had some things in common, like a Bill of Rights, separation of powers or three branches of government. There was a certain degree of voting, but that was only extended to white male landowners, and they all had elected officials. Now, the early state governments would be a great influence on the Articles of Confederation and later the Constitution. Another takeaway is that these early governments were certainly influenced by Enlightenment thinking, which had quite an impact on the colonies and early states. Also remember that the American form of government now is federalism, where there is a national level government, and then there are still state level governments like Pennsylvania, Delaware, and New Jersey. So definitely the roots of federalism can be traced back to this time period.